are requirements in Kettle Point, and there are requirements across the street in the Veterans Subdistrict on what you can do about Veterans Parkway. This amendment that the Waterfront Commission is proposing is silent about that. I think that should be included as it is proposed in the Metacomet Green Amendment. There's also a suggestion, recommendation, that the Waterfront Commission be able to hire an engineering company to do a peer study on the traffic study that the developer has to do. And that should be paid by the developer. The reason is it's going to become a very complicated and important issue, the traffic generation and what happens to it. And the city and the Waterfront Commission, they just don't have the expertise. And I think they're leaning in this direction to try to get a peer to review for the Waterfront Commission the traffic study. I think that should be in the plan, so there's no question about it. That's traffic. Veterans Memorial Parkway should include special protections because of the fact that Metacomet was developed at the same time 100 years ago, just with the Veterans Parkway, and has been this cherished view that people have had, historic view, very scenic view. It needs extra protection to protect that view. So that's number two. Number three is extraordinary outreach to the public so that the public gets involved in every decision that is made. There can be some simple steps made, and I think Mr. Fazioli is thinking about that, putting everything online. The last public hearing they held, you had to go down to City Hall to try to figure out what was going on. Just as easy, they could go online. I think Bill is thinking about that. There are other steps that planners can follow to make sure that the public is engaged in all of them. So I support these amendments. I hope you do. This is the chance for the council to reaffirm its interest in these issues and to put it right in the plan. It's very important that it's in the plan, that it's not just in the design guidelines, because the plan is the plan that you gentlemen and ladies control, not the design guidelines. That's just the Waterfront Commission. So I hope you can approve these amendments. I also support the effort to try to update the 2003 plan. You know, I think it's time. It's almost 20 years old. And I think I put a little paper together that I'm distributing around City Hall. And I know that Mr. Fazioli is also thinking along those lines. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next person, please.
Next person is Jane Crevier. Next would be William Conley.
Good evening, Mr. President and members of the council. I'm William Conley. I'm an attorney, and I'm here this evening as a member of the Marshall's team to make a few very brief introductory remarks and along with the team, answer any questions that you may have. With me tonight as a part of that team is Josh Belinsky, also an attorney from the office of Darrow Everett, and Mr. Belinsky would also be available to the council to answer any questions that you may have in light of some of the public comments that you've listened to. Also with me this evening is Michael Cassidy. Mike's a planner, and at the end of my very brief introductory remarks, I'm going to give you Mike's background and ask you to allow him to address some of the planning issues that you've heard addressed through the public comments this evening. Mr. Fazioli has really reviewed with you the procedural steps that brings us back to the council this evening 2 years after you passed the zone change ordinance that created this Metacomet sub-district, and 2 years after you enacted an amendment to your comprehensive plan. And so this is hardly a rush to judgment. Mr. Fazioli laid out to you the very meticulous steps and review by your staff professionals through the planning, the Waterfront District Commission that allows us to come back here to you this evening. I would say that I do need to contradict one misrepresentation, one specific misrepresentation that was made to you, in that if you look at the resolution before you this evening, you look at Exhibit 1, which is the amendment in front of the Waterfront District Commission, approved by the Waterfront District Commission, and the paragraph on the Metacomet sub-district, it clearly indicates 9.6 acres of the parcel throughout that section. I believe it's in there at least twice. So there's no need to correct any typographical error before the Waterfront District Commission. What was approved and what you can see in black and white in front of you is it says 9.6. Now, what's before you tonight for the resolution is really two very straightforward matters. The first is the acceptance of a deed from the marshals for that 9.6 acres. That deed conveys that 9.6 acres to you to meet a specific condition that you attach to that zone change ordinance. And we've gone through all of the steps as outlined by Mr. Fazioli before the planning board to have parcels A and B approved through the subdivision process so that we could come back to you and meet that condition. So we simply ask you to accept that deed in accordance with the condition that you created on that zoning ordinance. The second very straightforward action we're asking you to take tonight pursuant to this resolution is that you approve the modification to the 2003 East Providence Waterfront Special District Development Plan to incorporate this Metacomet sub-district into that 2003 plan. We've gone through all of the conditions precedent required of us to come back to you pursuant to that. So we ask you really to affirm your actions that you created, that you required in your ordinance and in your comp plan amendment 2 years ago. So with that and with your permission, Mr. President, I would like to ask Mr. Cassidy to address a few matters with the council. By way of introduction, Michael D. Cassidy has worked in the areas of planning and zoning his entire professional life. He specifically worked in zoning and planning for the city of Pawtucket, our neighbor, for over 40 years. He served as the director of planning and redevelopment for the city of Pawtucket for 18 years. He has served as the executive director of the Pawtucket Redevelopment Agency for another 15 years. So he has significant experience and expertise right here in our neighboring community in redevelopment and in planning. He was also integral to the development of the comprehensive plan in the city of Pawtucket as well. So if I may, Mr. President, ask that Mr. Cassidy address you, and I would ask you to accept him as an expert witness in the area of planning and redevelopment.
I will, however, he did sign up for public comment anyway, so he's on the list.
Oh, that's great. That makes it easier.
Anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Good job, Mike.
Good evening, council members. I am, as Mr. Conley said, I am a planning consultant. I'm working for Marshall Properties, and specifically I was asked to look at the amendment process here that's being used to amend the East Providence Waterfront District Plan. Your Waterfront Commission is basically a hybrid redevelopment agency. Drafters of the enabling legislation wanted a commission that would be able to redevelop such a large, over 300 acres and daunting area, brownfields, contaminated sites, wanting public access. And so nothing existed in the state law at that time. So new legislation was provided to specifically spell out what the East Providence Waterfront Commission would be able to do and the rules and regulations that would have to promulgate and follow. But the enabling legislation also says, quote, in order to provide for the consolidated and coordinated, efficient and effective exercise of public development powers affecting or benefiting the East Providence waterfront, the district shall have the powers of a special development district, a redevelopment agency, and the Public Buildings Authority. So the Redevelopment Act provides for how you amend a plan. And since the Waterfront Commission follows those rules, this is their first, it happens to be their first time amending the plan. Part of that is that the Waterfront Commission enabling legislation was very well thought out. And a matter of fact, in Chapter 8, it anticipates that it specifically mentions that the plan may take 10 to 20 years to complete. So you're in that 20-year period. And this is the first time that the Waterfront Commission has ever had to add an amendment to that plan. And that bodes well for the efforts that were put in at the beginning to identify all the sub-districts that East Providence wanted within the waterfront district. But redevelopment plans get amended all the time because the redevelopment enabling legislation has much more limited authority for redevelopment agencies than your Waterfront Commission has. So it's not unusual for a plan to be amended during its timeline to add new things. This happens to be unusual for East Providence because they did such a great job. An example is next door, Pelican Redevelopment Agency. I was the executive director of the redevelopment agency. They're currently operating on a plan from 1982. And the latest amendment to that plan was passed in 2019, which gave the redevelopment agency the authority to acquire the Apex properties, which we just did this past December. That amendment to allow them to acquire Apex was amendment number 17 to their redevelopment plan. So this is something that redevelopment agencies have to do all the time because of their limited authority. East Providence Watershed District has much greater authority, but this is the first time, so it seems to be unique. But it's not unique in how redevelopment activities get undertaken, and it's not unusual in how plans get amended for development districts like the Waterfront District. And
provides access to areas with significant potential for change, notably Kettle Point and the Chevron property. The potential impacts of these activities on the Veterans Memorial Parkway should be anticipated in order to preserve the parkway's unique scenic qualities and transportation functions. The extension of Waterfront Drive from Bold Point to the Chevron property, which would provide access along the bottom of the slope rather than exclusively from the parkway, should be explored. There's several comparable paragraphs, and I'm happy to read them, but I don't want to waste the council's time. My point is that in furtherance of Mike's point, your 2003 plan is quite comprehensive as it relates to the applicability of its provisions to development on the whole. So within the entirety of the waterfront district, you have a whole section, a whole chapter, or a subchapter rather, dedicated to Veterans Memorial Parkway, that any development, whether it be Kettle Point, for which I was one of the attorneys when we permitted that, to East Point, for which I also happen to be one of the attorneys that permitted that, to this development. And we don't get to pick and choose which provisions of the redevelopment plan are applicable. They all are. So we have a whole section of the Kettle Point of Veterans Memorial Parkway that we need to adhere to. Now, to Mr. Bowden's point as to traffic engineering and studies, let me just take East Point, which was just recently permitted by way of example. My client, separate client, submitted a traffic study. The city engaged a peer review that at the developer's expense to review and comment on that traffic study, resulting in refinement to that plan before it was ultimately approved. That is how permitting takes place. That is how land development is scheduled to occur. We are waiting for Waterfront to initiate design regulations, design guidelines for the Metacomet district, at which point it is incumbent upon Marshall to demonstrate to Waterfront its adherence to those regulations. And it is pro forma and it is expected that we will have to demonstrate to the commission's satisfaction that we meet these standards. And that is customary, and especially for development of this magnitude, we wouldn't expect anything less. East Providence has demonstrated an aptitude for land development and permitting throughout the last decade that demonstrates a sophistication and adherence to its protocol. And the point I want to leave you with is that this is just in keeping with the zone change that you ultimately approved last year, with the process that you in fact initiated. And this is just the end of the procedural requirements in order to proceed with the permitting of the development, which is where it will be a substantive, long, drawn-out project given the size of the development. And we have every intention of meeting those obligations. Briefly, the other thing I would want to say is Mr. Bowden briefly just referred to Kettle Point and how it spoke to Veterans Memorial Parkway, just for instance. And in Chapter 6, it says, access road from the Veterans Memorial Parkway must be carefully designed to be safe and efficient. The scale of development shall be limited by the traffic capacity of Veterans Memorial Parkway. That's an important guideline. That should apply to all sub-districts. But if Mr. Bowden or members of this council think that that was the only requirement we had to adhere to when we were building out Kettle Point, I would very much like 2.5 years of my life back. This is a process that takes time, and these are guidelines. And there is a rigmarole that we have to follow, and it's incumbent upon us to demonstrate to all of the municipal bodies in the city. So I just wanted to make that point out there and explain that I think the amendment's well-intentioned, but there's other provisions of the redevelopment plan that speak to the issue. And that's all.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Veterans Memorial Parkway is a state road.
Correct.
Okay, so any curb cuts, any roundabouts, any rotaries doesn't come from this body.
That's correct. It requires DOT consent.
We don't approve, we don't disapprove. We don't even have a say, actually. It comes from the state.
That's exactly right. And in Kettle Point, for instance, Council President Brito, that was a DOT consent for 2 cuts. And once those roads go into Kettle Point, those are pursuant to city guidelines, but those cuts off of Veterans Memorial Parkway are within DOT jurisdiction and require DOT.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you very much for the time.
That concludes public comment at this point in time. Bearings here. Council, any further discussion from the council?
Yeah, I have a couple of things I'd like to talk about. So I'm looking at these proposed amendments that Ms. Seal sent to us several days ago. Writing. And I guess just going through them one by one. So the proposed amendment under Section 2, requesting adding a second paragraph under the Metacomet sub-district. Guess, I don't know, the best thing to do is to read it so everybody hears it. All right, so this is the proposed amendment. An important overarching issue is the extensive community interest in this project. In addition to others, 2 major issues have been identified. One is the limitation of traffic generation so that there is no negative impact on the surrounding neighborhoods and on the Veterans Memorial Parkway. The second is to maintain and enhance the parkway as a current Rhode Island scenic roadway, to pursue its designation as a national scenic roadway, and to complete the nomination process for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. The golf course and parkway were developed simultaneously more than 100 years ago, and the resulting views have been cherished by the community ever since. I don't see a problem to adding that amendment to the plan. So adding that amendment to the proposed amendment to the plan. I don't see any issues with that. I think all of that is factual. I think it captures really the essence of what a lot of this push and pull has been about. with regard to how the property should be used, developed, how the parkway should be protected. Understanding the comments that we just heard, where a lot of that is sort of already worked into chapters 4 and 6 of the Waterfront District Plan. I still don't see the harm of including that paragraph. So I would be inclined to propose accepting that amendment as read into the proposed amendment that we're seeing, and this go back to the Waterfront District for ratification. So I'm starting discussion there, and I don't know how other folks feel.
Councilman, you're saying to go back to the Waterfront Commission?
Yeah, so
Amendment?
if we make, Mike, and correct me if I'm wrong, if we make changes to the plan that we're asked to approve tonight, or changes to the amendment that we're being asked to approve tonight, this must be re-ratified by the Waterfront District Commission.
Both bodies must approve the same redevelopment plan, the same exact language. So the answer is yes.
In addition to that, Councilman Cahoon, I do agree with that, adding that. But since we're solicitor, is there language in the Waterfront Commission plan that talks about a hotel at this point? And with that, would our ordinance supersede any language like that on the waterfront side? Vice versa.
Well, the use table is clear.